What if the greatest miracle in the Bible was not a blessing, but the birth of a curse? We are told Lazarus was raised from the dead, a testimony of divine power. But the scriptures fall silent on what came after. He spoke nothing of heaven, nothing of the grave. What if he returned not as a man restored, but as something else, something undying, something the church dares not name? The Gospel of John records that Lazarus lay dead 4 days, 4 days of decay, 4 days when his flesh should have been claimed by worms and rot. When Christ called, "Lazarus, come forth," the impossible happened. The dead obeyed. Wrapped in burial cloths, he stepped into the light. But here the story fractures. The gospel offers no details of his life after, as if the tale ends where it should have only begun. Why the silence? Why is a man pulled from death given no voice? Apocryphal accounts attempt to fill the void. In fragments from early writings, Lazarus is described as pale beyond natural sickness, his skin cold, his presence disturbing. Some noted his eyes gleamed red at night, as though lit from within. Food no longer nourished him. Bread rotted in his mouth, wine soured on his tongue, yet he endured. There are whispers that he walked by moonlight, alone, his lips darkened, though no feast was seen. Livestock in Bethany were found bloodless. Children wept when he drew near, and while his sisters clung to him, their neighbors crossed themselves in fear, saying, "The grave has not let him go." The church celebrated his resurrection, but buried his silence. Some claimed Lazarus became restless, unable to sleep, avoiding sunlight, aging slower than other men. What if being torn from death came with a price? Perhaps Lazarus was not simply restored. Perhaps he was remade, a man pulled from beyond the veil, but no longer belonging to life or death, a man cursed to thirst. And if this is true, then Lazarus was not just a miracle. He was the first of the undead. When a miracle occurs in Scripture, it is proclaimed. The blind see, the lame walk, the possessed are freed. Testimonies are given, names are remembered. But Lazarus, he rises, and then he vanishes into silence. No testimony, no account of heaven, not even a single word preserved on his own lips. Why? Some scholars suggest the silence was deliberate, that to speak of what Lazarus became would unsettle faith more than strengthen it. For in apocryphal writings, outside the polished canon, a different picture emerges. Fragments of Gnostic texts describe Lazarus as the one who walks but does not rest. In the Gospel of the Hebrews, now lost but cited by early church fathers, there is a line attributed to him: "I died, but I was not permitted to enter." The implication is chilling. Lazarus was denied the afterlife, brought back, yes, but no longer belonging to God nor to man. Origen, the great Alexandrian theologian, pondered Lazarus's fate with unease. He wrote that perhaps Lazarus returned only in body, not in soul. Tertullian went further, asking why Lazarus is absent from the apostolic mission, if his resurrection was the greatest proof of Christ's power, unless, Tertullian warned, the miracle concealed a terror not to be spoken. Whispers grew darker in later centuries. In some Gnostic sects, Lazarus was viewed not as a saint, but as a warning. He was said to thirst continually and shun the dawn. Peasants in early Christian communities whispered that he was pale as snow, his eyes heavy with red fire, that he lingered too long near blood spilled in the marketplace. Even in Byzantine records, where relics of Lazarus were claimed to be preserved, bishops wrote of unease. One chronicle from Cyprus described how his body, when unearthed, did not rot, as other saints did, but neither did it look at peace. Its skin remained taut, its eyes hollow, its mouth strangely parted. The chronicler called it a body that defied corruption, but did not invite holiness. If Lazarus was denied heaven and chained again to the earth, then his silence may be the loudest testimony of all. The Gospels showed the miracle. Tradition recorded the consequence. Lazarus did not die again, as all men must. He endured. A man out of place, exiled from death itself. And so, the question lingers, like the grave dust clinging to his robes. Did Christ perform a miracle of mercy? Or did he open the door to a hunger mankind was never meant to know? As Christianity spread beyond Judea, the tale of Lazarus traveled with it. Missionaries spoke of Christ's miracle, but among common people, those who lived close to the earth and feared the Diabo night, the story took on a darker hue. To them, a man who had tasted death and walked again was not blessed, but dangerous. In rural Europe, Lazarus's name began to blend with whispers of revenants, beings who rose from their graves, pale, hollow, and thirsting. In Slavic lands, centuries before the word vampire appeared, there were stories of Upirs and Nosferatu, the dead who walked at night, preying upon the living. Some chroniclers trace their origins not to pagan gods, but to a figure in the Christian gospel, the man called out of the tomb who would not die again. Legends in Cyprus, where Lazarus was said to have fled after his resurrection, tell of a bishop whose skin was cold, who rarely appeared in daylight, and who never smiled. Peasants whispered that he was the man who feared heaven, that birds fell silent when he passed, and that no vineyard would bear fruit near his dwelling. Over time, these stories fused with older traditions of the undead, giving birth to something new: Christianity's own vampire. Even medieval sermons betray unease. Priests warn their flocks not to seek life after death, as Lazarus did, lest you rise in darkness. 1/12th century homily describes Lazarus as one who carried the grave in his breath, who walked as proof that death could be cheated, but never without consequence. By the Renaissance, artists painted Lazarus not with rosy flesh restored, but with sallow skin and hollow eyes. He was depicted standing at the tomb's mouth like a specter, a figure who belonged more to the grave than to the living. To scholars of folklore, these depictions align not with saints, but with vampires. It is no coincidence that the earliest vampire stories describe creatures who do not rot, who walk among men yet are not of them, who avoid sunlight, and who thirst for blood. All these qualities echo the silences around Lazarus's second life. For the miracle explains how he rose, but not how he lived afterward. And so the question lingers, was Lazarus the seed from which Europe's vampire myths first grew? Did peasants whisper his name around the fire, not as a tale of salvation, but as a warning that death, once broken, never returns empty-handed? For centuries, the Church proclaimed the raising of Lazarus as one of Christ's greatest miracles. It was painted into cathedrals, carved into stone, sung in liturgies. Yet behind this triumphant narrative lies something unusual, an absence. Unlike other saints, Lazarus was given no feast day in the earliest calendars. His life after resurrection was rarely preached, and his words never quoted. The miracle was celebrated, but the man himself seemed quietly pushed into shadow. Why? Some scholars believe the church was forced to contain his story. By the 4th century, folklore around Lazarus had begun to darken. In Cyprus, where tradition claimed he fled, locals whispered that their bishop never aged. Pilgrims who came to see his relics wrote of a body preserved too well, lips parted as though thirsty. Rumors spread that his presence blighted crops, that animals shied away from his touch. These tales threatened doctrine. Resurrection was meant to be proof of God's power over death. But what if that resurrection looked too much like a curse to silence doubt? The church began reshaping Lazarus's image. Homilies emphasized his holiness, erasing folk accounts of his pallor and nocturnal wanderings. Byzantine writers insisted that he laughed only once after being raised, a symbol of sobriety, but perhaps also an attempt to explain away his unsettling demeanor. Records of Lazarus's relics reveal further unease. When his supposed body was moved from Cyprus to Constantinople in the 9th century, witnesses described it as uncorrupted. Yet even in reverent texts, the phrasing is cold, not glowing with sanctity, but preserved in unnatural stillness. A bishop of the era wrote, "It is a marvel and a burden that his flesh does not decay." Over time, theological disputes only deepened the silence. Why did Lazarus's resurrection differ from Christ's? Christ rose in glory, transformed, never to die again. Lazarus, we are told, rose only to die once more. Yet no record of his second death exists. No place of burial is universally agreed upon. Some say Cyprus, others Marseille. A few claim his body was never buried at all. This lack of closure unsettled believers. So the church did what it has done with many dangerous legends. It celebrated the miracle, but obscured the man. Lazarus became an icon of Christ's power, not a figure of history. His silence, his strangeness, his possible curse, these were hidden in the vaults of tradition, tucked into margins, erased from sermons. But folklore cannot be erased. And in taverns, villages, and whispered prayers, Lazarus lingered, not as a saint, but as something else. A man who had defied death, but at a cost. A man who walked again, but not fully alive. Perhaps the church did not bury him because they could not. By the Middle Ages, Lazarus had become both venerated and feared. Officially, the church clung to the image of a holy man, resurrected by Christ and later serving as bishop in Cyprus or Marseille. But outside cathedral walls, his legend wandered into darker territory. Among common folk, the idea of a man who had been dead for 4 days, yet walked again, felt too close to the revenants that haunted their nightmares. In Slavic regions, villagers told tales of corpses rising from the grave to drink the blood of the living. These tales often began with a whisper, like Lazarus. Peasants did not question Christ's power, but they questioned what it meant. If a man was ripped from death's grip, did he return whole or tainted? Stories spread that Lazarus was restless, never smiling, rarely seen beneath the sun. In some villages, he was described as the first of the pale ones, whose eyes glowed faintly red by torchlight. In others, mothers warned their children to be indoors before nightfall, lest the Bishop of Bethany pass by. It was during this period that vampire legends began to crystallize. Revenants who fed on the living were said to fear the cross and holy water. Yet their origins were often traced not to demons, but to the church itself. Scholars have noted that Lazarus' story provided the perfect seed, a man resurrected not by sorcery, but by divine command, and yet not quite alive. Chroniclers in Eastern Europe wrote of corpses exhumed that did not decay, whose lips bore traces of blood. Priests used the word Lazarene as a curse for such beings, suggesting that the very name of Christ's miracle had been twisted into a warning. Meanwhile, art reflected the same unease. Gothic paintings showed Lazarus emerging from the tomb, not in radiant health, but gaunt, hollow-eyed, half-shadow. The people who viewed these images did not see salvation. They saw a ghost of flesh. The blending of Lazarus's tale with vampire myth may explain why his figure looms so large in folklore. Even when scripture is silent, the faithful were told to honor him, but the people feared him. He became both saint and specter, miracle and monster, and perhaps that is the true power of his story. A reminder that miracles, once born, cannot be controlled. They take on lives of their own, sometimes holy, sometimes horrifying. By the medieval era, Europe was consumed with fear of the dead who would not rest. Entire villages exhumed corpses suspected of rising again. Bodies were burned, pierced with stakes, or buried face down. But behind these practices lurked a paradox. The very religion meant to bring comfort had given birth to its own nightmare. At the center of this paradox stood Lazarus. The church declared his resurrection a holy sign, yet at the same time, it fought to suppress vampire hysteria, spreading across the continent. Bishops wrote edicts condemning belief in blood drinkers as superstition. Priests assured their flocks that corpses could not rise without God's will. Yet the people remembered Lazarus, and they remembered too well. If one man had been raised, why not others? And what if those others came back hungry? Records from Eastern Europe reveal how often Lazarus's name was whispered alongside vampire terrors. A 13th century sermon from Hungary warned against confusing Christ's miracle with the restless ones who thirst for blood. The preacher insisted Lazarus was holy, but by naming him, he kept the association alive. In truth, every denial fanned the fire of rumor. Inquisition records show that some accused of witchcraft claimed protection from the spirit of Lazarus, twisting his legend into a talisman of undead power. Peasant communities invoked him not as a saint, but as the proof that life and death could be defied. The church responded with silence, erasing these references from official liturgies, burying uncomfortable accounts of incorrupt relics, and rewriting tales that strayed too far into shadow. Yet suppression could not erase the unease. Villagers continued to place stones in the mouths of the dead, crosses at thresholds, and garlic on windowsills. They feared Lazarus's fate might repeat in their own graveyards, and every unrotting corpse uncovered by accident was seen not as a saint, but as another like him, returned, cursed, and thirsting. The irony was inescapable. The church preached hope through resurrection, but the people feared damnation through the same miracle. Lazarus's silence after his rising left a vacuum, and into that silence poured centuries of dread. The church had created the first vampire legend, though it would never admit it. The Renaissance rekindled humanity's obsession with hidden knowledge. Ancient texts were unearthed, heretical writings copied in secret, and forgotten legends studied with fresh eyes. In this climate, Lazarus re-emerged, not as a saintly figure, but as a mystery scholars could not ignore. Occultists whispered that Lazarus was more than a miracle. He was the first link in a hidden chain, the bloodline of the undying. Italian humanists who studied suppressed gospels asked a dangerous question. If Lazarus never truly died a second time, then where was he now? And if he still walked, could others share his fate? Secret societies such as the Rosicrucians hinted at the possibility of immortals dwelling among men. Some manuscripts even referenced a man of Bethany, whose shadow was never shortened by the sun. He was described as pale, austere, and older than centuries should allow. To the faithful, this was blasphemy. To seekers of forbidden truth, it was proof. Artists of the era, fascinated by death and resurrection, painted Lazarus not in triumph, but in torment. Caravaggio's dark rendition of his raising showed him not as glorified, but ghastly. Skin gray, eyes glazed, fingers curled like claws. Critics later asked, was Caravaggio hinting at something the church dared not admit? Meanwhile, folk tales in France and Germany merged Lazarus with local vampire lore. Villagers told of a wanderer who never aged, who drank wine but left the cup stained red long after. In some valleys, Lazarene became a term not for saintliness, but for those who seemed touched by death and yet not consumed by it. This blending of theology, folklore, and occult curiosity transformed Lazarus into something new, not simply a man raised, but a possible progenitor of the vampire myth. His silence, his absence from Scripture's later pages, became louder in an age obsessed with uncovering what had been buried. The church fought back by doubling down on his sainthood, elevating feast days and relics to anchor him in holiness. But the Renaissance mind was restless, and the whispers continued. To many, Lazarus was no longer proof of Christ's power. He was evidence of an immortal curse. And in the candlelit chambers of alchemists, the question was no longer whether Lazarus had lived again, but whether his blood still walked the earth. The Enlightenment promised answers. Science, not superstition, was to illuminate the mysteries of the world. Yet, when thinkers turned their gaze toward the legend of Lazarus, their conclusions were no less unsettling. Philosophers and naturalists sought to rationalize miracles. Could Lazarus's resurrection have been a case of catalepsy, a body so still, so near to death, that it fooled the eyes of mourners? Medical treatises speculated that he may have slipped into a coma, his breath too faint to detect, his pulse vanished from trembling fingers. Christ, they argued, had not raised the dead, but awakened one who had never fully died. But this explanation faltered against the ancient accounts. 4 days in the tomb, the stench of decay already rising, the ceiling stone rolled away. Was catalepsy enough to explain a body preserved, then animated? And if not, what force sustained him? Scientists of the era recorded cases of corpses exhumed across Europe that showed no signs of rot. Physicians dissected such bodies, expecting to find natural preservation, but often recoiled at what they discovered. Tissues unnaturally supple, veins filled not with congealed blood, but with something darker. Reports noted the lips stained, the lungs inexplicably full. In the language of the people, these were vampires. But in hushed academic circles, some dared to whisper Lazarus was the first. The Enlightenment also birthed a fascination with electricity, the spark of life. Galvani's experiments with reanimating frogs' legs led some to wonder, had Christ not performed a miracle, but unlocked a hidden law of nature? If so, what walked out of that tomb may not have been a man restored, but a man transformed. Something neither alive nor dead, caught between laws human reason could not measure. Writers of the time began blending theology with philosophy. Voltaire questioned why Scripture never told us of Lazarus' second death. Goethe wrote of the terror of a man forced back from eternity, a soul chained unwillingly to flesh. These reflections painted Lazarus not as a triumph of faith, but as a tragedy of existence. In the age of reason, the miracle was no longer a miracle. It was a problem, and problems that cannot be solved become legends or curses. By the 19th century, Europe was enthralled by darkness. The Gothic age birthed a new fascination with graveyards, midnight ruins, and the living dead. And in this brooding atmosphere, the story of Lazarus was reborn, not as saint, but as specter. Writers such as Shelley, Byron, and later, Stoker drew from fragments of Scripture and folklore to weave their immortal characters. Though Dracula became the most enduring, Lazarus lingered at the edges of their inspiration. For what was a vampire, if not a man who had once died, yet could not remain in the grave? Poets described him with horror. Heinrich Heine wrote of the pale one who walked out of Bethany, carrying the silence of the tomb in his eyes. Some Gothic sermons warned that the true terror of Lazarus was not his betrayal of death, but his inability to live fully again. He became a tragic archetype, forever suspended between two worlds. The vampire craze of the century, sparked by Polidori's The Vampire, and reaching its peak in Stoker's Dracula, fed on ancient anxieties. Scholars began to draw parallels, noting that Lazarus was the first recorded figure to return physically from the grave. Some even accused the church of suppressing this link, lest its miracle be mistaken for a curse. Meanwhile, local legends gave Lazarus new life. In Marseille, whispers claimed a man had been seen wandering the catacombs centuries after his supposed burial. In Cyprus, shepherds told of a shadow in priestly garb, tall, gaunt, with lips too red and eyes too hollow to belong to the living. These stories circulated in tandem with the new vampire novels, fusing fact and fiction into something eerily believable. The Gothic imagination thrived on ambiguity, and Lazarus provided it in abundance. He was not myth alone, nor pure scripture. He was a man recorded in holy texts, yet shrouded in silence afterward. A miracle with no ending, a death with no closure. And so he became a symbol not only of resurrection, but of unease. In every flickering candle of Gothic literature, in every shadowed chapel painting, Lazarus was there, an unwelcome ancestor to the vampire legends that followed. In the modern age, Lazarus has not been forgotten. He has been re-examined by theologians, historians, and conspiracy theorists alike. Each camp seeks to explain what happened in Bethany and why Scripture is so silent about what followed. Some scholars argue that Lazarus' story was deliberately reshaped to fit the church's needs. Resurrection was meant to prove Christ's divinity, not raise questions of lingering half-death. Thus, Lazarus' afterlife was reduced to fragments. He is mentioned only briefly, then disappears. This vanishing act, they claim, was no accident, but an attempt to suppress an inconvenient truth. Meanwhile, fringe researchers have taken a darker path. They note the tales of Lazarus align too neatly with vampire folklore. A body returned from the grave, preserved beyond decay, feared by the people, avoided by animals, silent yet watching. In online forums and obscure journals, they call him the first vampire, the prototype from which all later legends flow. Archaeological rumors add fuel to the fire. In the 20th century, excavations in Cyprus claim to uncover a sarcophagus marked Lazarus, friend of Christ. Yet within it lay bones far too intact for their age, with traces of a strange reddish residue clinging to the teeth. Official reports dismissed the find as misattributed, but whispers remain. Even popular culture cannot leave him buried. Films, novels, and documentaries return again and again to the question, What became of the man who had already died once? The silence of Scripture is too loud to ignore. If Lazarus died again, where is his grave? If he did not, then where is he now? And so, in the 21st century, Lazarus stands as both miracle and myth. To some, he is a symbol of divine hope. To others, he is proof of something older, darker, a curse disguised as salvation. His story endures because it is incomplete, and incompleteness demands answers. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Lazarus. Not certainty, but doubt. A reminder that what was raised in Bethany may not have been life restored, but something else entirely. Something still walking, still waiting, in the long shadows between faith and fear.